Let me help you not waste money if you're having a tough time choosing between the iPad 10 and the iPad mini 6. So the iPad 10 does have a new design, new display, and a USB-C port, but there are still some critical differences between the two, even when it comes to accessories. So let's see which one is actually better. Now we'll revisit the price later on when we talk about the configuration options. But in the US, the iPad 10 starts at $449 and the Mini 6 starts at $499. So there's a $50 difference. And I know the prices outside of the US are very different, so let me know in the comment section where you're from and what these two iPads cost where you live. Now, probably the first decision you have to make is about size, because from a design standpoint, both iPads have rounded corners and squared off edges. So the Mini pretty much looks like a smaller version of the iPad 10. Both are offered in 4 colors, but having seen all the options in real life, the iPad 10 colors are definitely more saturated. So if a pop of color is important to you, the iPad 10 is the way to go. And by the way, I love the pink one that I got. Now back to size, we're looking at an 8.3-inch display for the Mini and a 10.9-inch display for the iPad 10. So that's a pretty significant difference with several implications. First of all, if you're going to use this display to watch movies or to play games, you're going to get a much bigger image on the iPad 10. We'll talk more about the quality and the type of the display later on, but when you're surfing the web or using productivity apps, the difference in the amount of content that you see isn't as big as you may think because the resolution of both iPads is fairly close. It's also important that we look at size in terms of portability. And here, of course, the iPad mini is smaller and lighter, but I want you to think about whether that's actually important to you for how you use your iPad. So personally, when I travel or even if I just go to a coffee shop, I always have the iPad in a backpack. So the size and weight difference isn't super meaningful to me in terms of portability. But again, it may be for you. I also want you to think about the actual user experience. So if you have smaller hands, the iPad mini might be more comfortable for you to use or to game on because it's a much smaller device. And I wasn't sure if gaming on it would feel different than playing on the iPhone 14 Pro Max, but it definitely does, and you absolutely get a tablet gaming experience. For biometric authentication, both iPads got rid of the home button. They use Apple's new Touch ID, which is incorporated into the power button. Now, when it comes to the display, both iPads have a liquid retina display, both are True Tone displays, and both have the same peak brightness. But the iPad mini's P3 display supports a wider color gamut than the sRGB on the iPad 10. This means that it's able to reproduce more colors with better accuracy, and it's more true to what those colors look like in real life. Now, the iPad mini also has a higher pixel density, so the image is technically sharper, and it has an anti-reflective coating, so it's a better option if you're outside or if you're in an environment where you have to deal with bright lights. Now, one other important difference between the displays is that the iPad 10 does not have a fully laminated display, meaning that there's an air gap between the display itself and the combination of touch layer and cover glass. On the iPad mini, all 3 layers are fused into a single display assembly, so there's no air gap, but there are pros and cons to each type of display. So first of all, both displays are super responsive and super accurate, and the main difference comes into play when you're using the Apple Pencil. On the iPad mini, it's going to look like the tip of the pencil is actually touching the content that's being created. On the iPad 10, you're gonna see a little bit of separation, especially when you look at an angle. Now, I mainly use the Apple Pencil for taking notes, for marking up documents, and for very light sketching. So the air gap isn't a big deal for me, but I know that my friends who are illustrators and can create amazing content with both iPads, when given the chance, they prefer a fully laminated display. Now, the one advantage of the iPad 10 display is that if you scratch or crack it, you're most likely only damaging the top layer, which is much less expensive to replace. On the iPad mini, regardless of whether you just scratch the top layer, the entire display assembly would have to be replaced, which of course is much more expensive. And since I brought up the Apple Pencil, let's talk about accessories because there are a lot of important differences and maybe even some deal breakers. Starting out, even though both iPads have USB-C ports and flat edges, only the iPad mini 6 is compatible with the 2nd generation Apple Pencil, which charges and pairs wirelessly, and it can be magnetically attached and stored on the side of the iPad. The iPad 10 still uses the first generation Apple Pencil, and my opinion about this might be different than what you've already heard. So first of all, the tips on both pencils are the same. So the actual feel isn't any different. Having said that, I like the second generation pencil better. It's smaller, it's less slippery, it has a flat edge, so it's more comfortable to hold, and it's less likely to roll off the desk. And because it charges wirelessly, it's always fully charged and ready to go. With the first generation pencil and the iPad 10, you can't charge it by plugging it into the iPad because we're getting Lightning on a pencil and USB-C on the iPad 10. Now, the good news about that is that unlike with the iPad 9, you won't accidentally damage the port or the pencil if you hit it while it's charging. The downside is that you need a $9 adapter in order to pair or charge your Apple Pencil. So is this the worst thing ever? No, but is it less than optimal? Absolutely. For me, it means that with the iPad 10, the Apple Pencil isn't always charged. It means that I need to bring another accessory with me whenever I travel, and it also means that I need to keep track of another piece of gear in my studio. Now, since I always lose things, I just keep the adapter on a dedicated USB-C cable, then I use another cable to charge my iPad, and that way the adapter is never just loose on my desk. So ultimately, the first generation Apple Pencil wouldn't be a reason for me not to get the iPad 10, but I would want to be aware of the less than ideal user experience, because if I'm buying the iPad 10 now, I plan on keeping it for the next 5 to 7 years, and that means that I'll still be using the first generation Apple Pencil all that time. Now, another option, if you prefer the larger form factor and you still want the second generation Apple Pencil, is to look for a refurbished iPad Air 4, which is also going to give you a few other benefits. Now, when we look at keyboard cases, then things definitely shift in favor of the iPad 10. Now, there are keyboard cases for the Mini, but it's such a small iPad that the keyboards are extremely uncomfortable to type on, to the point where I've never used mine beyond testing. If I really want to type on the iPad Mini 6, I'll just pair it with a Bluetooth keyboard and then get a much better user experience. With the iPad 10, Apple actually introduced the new Magic Keyboard Folio. It has a great keyboard with a full row of function keys. It has an amazing trackpad. It has an adjustable back so you can control the angle of the iPad, and the keyboard can be detached when you don't need it and even reattached in the opposite direction so you can fold it back when you're using the iPad in tablet mode and you don't want the keys to get in the way. Another interesting difference has to do with the camera system. So on the back, both iPads have a 12 megapixel wide camera with the same f1.8 aperture, same 5x digital zoom, and smart HDR3 for photos. But only the iPad Mini has a flash. For video, we're getting the same capabilities in terms of resolution, frame rate, slow motion, and zoom. With the front-facing camera, we're seeing the same camera in terms of hardware, but it's on the short edge of the iPad Mini 6 and on the long edge of the iPad 10. So with the iPad Mini and every other iPad other than the iPad 10, when you're using the camera in landscape mode, the camera is off to the side and it creates a strange angle when you're looking at the display. With the iPad 10, because the camera is centered on the long edge, you're properly framed and the camera is also higher off the desk, which is a better angle. And here's a quick sample. This is a camera and microphone test of the iPad 10 and the iPad Mini 6. This should give you a pretty good idea of the type of image quality that you're going to get and the type of audio quality that you should expect. I also want to show you the difference in framing. So this is me looking at the iPad 10 camera. This is me looking at the iPad 10 display. And then this is me looking at the iPad Mini 6 camera, and this is me looking at the iPad Mini 6 display. Now, as far as the speakers, both iPads have landscape stereo speakers. So you're getting one speaker on each side when you hold them in landscape mode. But the iPad 10 gets louder, it sounds warmer, and it definitely has a less tinny sound than the iPad Mini 6. As far as processing power, the iPad 10 comes with the A14 Bionic, and the iPad Mini 6 comes with the more powerful A15 Bionic, and both iPads have 4 GB of RAM. If we're only looking at raw processing power, the iPad Mini 6 has better single and multi-core performance, and it also has a more powerful 5-core GPU, which outperforms the 4-core GPU on the iPad 10. For typical things like surfing the web, watching YouTube, Netflix, working with basic productivity apps, you're not very likely to notice a difference because both chips are extremely powerful. So both iPads are fast, responsive, they quickly wake from sleep, apps open very quickly, and then switching between apps is practically instant. So yes, the iPad mini 6 does have a more powerful chip, and I'll get to gaming in just a minute. But for most things, the average user is not going to notice a major bump in performance. Now, when it comes to multitasking, both iPads have the same features, but I'm going to give the edge to the iPad 10 because of the larger and higher resolution display. It's also a better option for sidecar and universal control, again, because of the larger size. And by the way, if you don't use sidecar, you really should. I use it almost every day. It's great. And if you're not familiar with sidecar or universal control, I'm going to link to these two videos at the end of this one. Now, as far as battery life, the actual amount of screen on time is going to depend on what you're doing. But for side-by-side tests, the iPad 10 has lasted longer for me, and I'm finishing up a complete battery drain test, so if you want to be notified when it's published, hit the subscribe and notification buttons. The one area where battery life definitely comes into play is gaming. So I already mentioned the more powerful chip on the iPad mini 6, but the most noticeable difference between the two isn't in performance or in resolution, it's in ergonomics. The iPad mini is awesome to play on. It's so light, it's super comfortable to hold even after a few hours of gaming, and it's definitely better than gaming on a phone. If I'm connecting a controller and I'm using the iPad just as a display, then I'm going to give the edge to the iPad 10, again, because of the larger display, and as I mentioned, it does have better battery life. Now, we're not getting a headphone jack with either of these, so if that's something that you're interested in, check out the iPad 10, which will also save you some money. And speaking of money, the $449 for the iPad 10 and the $499 for the iPad mini 6 are the official prices from the Apple Store, but you can usually find better prices by using the links in the description. In any case, these are the prices for the 64GB versions of both, and it will cost you an additional $150 to upgrade to the 256GB models. Now, I really wish that Apple started both of these iPads at 128 and then had an upgraded version at 512. Especially for the iPad 10, which was released at the end of 2022. Now, both iPads support Wi-Fi 6. The iPad 10 supports Bluetooth 5.2 versus 5.0 on the iPad mini 6, and both are available in cellular models which support 5G. All right, so how would I make this decision to make sure that I don't waste my money? Now, I would love to know what you think in the comment section. So I would get the iPad mini 6 if I prioritized portability and preferred the ergonomics of a smaller tablet, if I was looking for a better user experience with the Apple Pencil, if I wanted a more color accurate display, and if a more powerful processor was important to me. I would get the iPad 10 if I wanted to save a couple of bucks, if I preferred a larger display for multitasking, viewing content, and gaming. I would also get the iPad 10 if I wanted to use it with a keyboard case as more of a laptop replacement, and also if better battery life was a priority for me. Now you should check out Sidecar and Universal Control. Hopefully this comparison helped you save money. Click on my face to subscribe. You know what I always say, buy it nice or buy it twice. Good luck and see you soon.